Hello, Imperfect Leaders. You can now pre-order my book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership and After Action, by going to Amazon, Barnes & Noble. In fact, I've been seeing it online at lots of bookstores. So I am told that pre-ordering is an important part of the book publishing process. So thank you for your support. I was recently reading an article in Fortune magazine, and I'm not actually really sure how it ended up in our mailbox, but I was hooked by the cover photo of the CEO of Salesforce with the title, "Efficiency is in. Is empathy out?" The model that I use to lead others stresses empathy, walking in someone else's shoes, and compassion, being with people, two traits that fuel connection, that they are the core tenets of our work. So I was really interested to see what the article said. The article actually didn't answer the question exactly. Instead, it spoke of the tension that CEOs have as they make decisions for the long-term health of their companies, and how those decisions are sometimes interpreted as a betrayal of a CEO's publicly stated values. School districts and district leaders, they understand that really well. They are constantly making efforts to find common ground, and that sometimes is interpreted as capitulation. But there was a quote in the article that I liked. The CEO of Salesforce said, "I think you have to have, as the Japanese say, Shoshin, or beginner's mind. As a leader, you have to realize that the past is gone, and that you're going to have to create a new future." My guest today became a superintendent right when the global pandemic was forcing everything to close. Located almost on the border of two states, he was trying to make sense of two different decision rules, different recommendations. He demonstrated Shoshin, and he helped his district create a new future. I think you're really going to enjoy Mark Martin and his leadership behind Closing the Gap Kentucky and his perspective on rethinking special education. Thanks for listening. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Mark Martin is my guest. Mark is superintendent of the Meade County Schools in Meade County, Kentucky. And before becoming their superintendent, he was director of special education. And before that, he spent 12 years as a special education teacher and administrator. Mark, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Peter, thank you for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and talk to you a little bit more about Meade County Schools.
Well, it is so nice to meet you. I've really been looking forward to our conversation because whenever I have a conversation with a leader in Kentucky, they are doing some really impressive things. And I'm not kidding. I mean, the Kentucky delegation is leading the way in public education advocacy. An example would be a recent Kentucky Supreme Court victory to protect public education funding. That was huge. And another example is Close the Gap Kentucky. And in the journey, as you call it, you talk about chasing a process. And I wonder, would you tell us just about Close the Gap Kentucky, why it's important for Kentucky, and really what other states can learn from your work?
Yeah, so I have to back up a little bit to my time entering Meade County Schools. So I taught and coached for 6 years in Owensboro, Kentucky. In Davis County Public Schools, district of about 11,000 students, one of the larger school districts in Kentucky. And I came to Meade County in 2014 as special education director. I did some other administration jobs as well. So really, we wanted to talk about how are we going to be vertically aligned, prepare students for a quality life, all students. And that includes students with disabilities. And we wanted to give a balanced continuum of services to students with disabilities. It's hardwired, really, for many decades on how we educate students with disabilities, as far as you have your co-teaching regular ed setting and you have your resource setting. And that's where you get your core instruction exposure. Well, we felt that was archaic and that wasn't meeting the new needs of students with disabilities. So we brought a balanced approach to that, which we call supplemental resource. So students are pushed in for all their core instruction through a co-teaching model. And then we have a dedicated intervention period during the day, MTSS, as some states may refer to it, multi-tiered support services. And during that time is when our students with disabilities get their special education services. So we really started that 10-year journey in 2014 and building the foundation of that, setting the culture of that district belief, which is really the first of our 5 keys. And we've had a lot of success over the years of closing gaps for all students, free reduced students, gifted students. And we've really gotten good at differentiating for all, including students with disabilities. So in 2019, we were discovered, a 2018-2019 school year. And from March of 2019 through March of 2020, we had over 800 visitors from 61 Kentucky school districts, the Kentucky Board of Education, Western Kentucky University, University of Louisville, board members from other school districts that just wanted to learn how are we closing gaps. We were trying to discover because our data was improving. We'd helped a district or two. The Kentucky Department of Education discovered us and really reached out to other districts to come to us. And then the pandemic happened in March of 2020. If it wasn't for the pandemic, we were going to go over 1,000 visitors in about 12 to 14 months. And we really decided during the pandemic, when we resumed visits, that really joining us for 6 hours and then having lunch with us and hearing our story was not going to help them help students. And the Meade County Schools were really about helping school districts across the Commonwealth. And we wanted to take those school districts on a journey for 12 months. So school districts are investing in the Meade County Schools for us to really show them the way, not just tell them the way. So we're giving them an in-depth look of really our 5 keys, our processes. And that's what you know as Close the Gap Kentucky. There are 12 school districts from Western Kentucky to Eastern Kentucky and then Western Kentucky University that we started working with last June, and we're completing cohort 1 right now. Those districts, the majority of them have expressed interest to come back for a second year. There are new school districts that we're going to consider for a second cohort as well.
I'm glad you took us a step back, because I think what is different about you as a superintendent is that not many superintendents have followed the path of a special educator to then becoming a leader of a district. And what I mean by that is that often superintendents are leaning on their directors of special education as they are struggling with, how can I best meet the needs of children and avoid a pull-out model that has children of varying abilities and needs all in one classroom and expecting one special educator to meet all of their needs, K through 12 in some instances. It's sort of a, I'm being compliant, but I'm not being visionary. And what you appear to have done is said, let's think more thoughtfully about the needs of children, have them attending their classroom alongside their peers, and then just like any other child who needs intervention at some point in the day, as you referred to it as the multi-tiered systems of support, which is a mouthful for those who are not in education, but basically just means meeting the needs of children at a certain point in their time at school. And then that be the time where their individualized education plans, all of their goals, that's where they're being met, is in this specialized time that everybody is getting, but at a specific time for that child. I think that's really, really a thoughtful way of doing it. And then if I understand correctly, you had all these visitors coming to your school to see how you were doing it. And as a thoughtful leader, you and your team took a step back again and said, we can continue to show them how we do it, but each of them have their own districts, their own cultures, their own personnel, their own abilities, and some things that they have that we don't have, some things that we have that they don't have. And so instead, we're going to create a cohort of support where we're all going to learn together, and then they can go back to their districts, take what they learn from us, but apply it in their way. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. You know, they can't do it the Meade County way. They've got to do it the way that works for them and their team. You know, we're a district of 5,000 students. We're a medium to large size school district. We have districts in our cohorts that have 11,000, 12,000 students. We have some that have 1,500. So we know their configurations are different, but this is something we can all agree on, I believe, is that if all students are regular ed students first, that the regular education department and the special education department have to be attached to the hip. And that's what we did during the 2014-15 school year from our district level support. And we cascaded that down to our principals first, our teachers, all the way through our 5 keys that we teach. And I believe I'm very passionate about students with disabilities. Obviously, I was a special education teacher, care deeply about elevating that platform. I would tell you that from the federal government down to the state departments of education, we like to be in silos when it comes to special education. And there's much special education law and litigation. If not for it, that we would not be in the place we are where students with disabilities are in school. So I'm very grateful for that. But the ball has not been advanced up the hill at a great enough pace. And we really believe in 3 prongs. You got to have great core instruction, culture before process, process before strategy. But when you start talking about 3 prongs of instruction, you're talking about great core instruction that all students have access to, not just the ones it's convenient for. Okay, and that's students that are diploma track, non-diploma track. And then number two would be that multi-tier support system where every day, high school all the way down to, preschool, you got to have dedicated intervention time. And then finally, co-teaching. And co-teaching, where both teachers are providing direct instruction. In Meade County Schools, we endorse station teaching and parallel teachings. We want our students to be engaged, provide student discourse to each other, mixed ability groups, gifted students learning with students that are in tier 2, tier 3, all the way to special education, because that's the way the real world is. We want our classrooms to reflect that. And then finally, we want students speaking their thinking. And we have found when we put students working together in great structures where the regular ed and special ed teacher are attached at the hip, we have found a lot of success with that. So you have nailed that on the head. That's a quick summary of what we do with these school districts.
You've mentioned two more things, and then I'll move on to my next question. One is station teaching and parallel teaching. And I just want to make sure that I understand that's where each of the two teachers who may be in a classroom may have small groups that they're working with, or they are working side by side. Is that a definition of station versus parallel?
Yeah, parallel teaching would be the same content is being taught by both teachers, just in small groups. So if you have 30 kids in a high school English class, 15 on one side, 15 on the other. There are a lot of barriers to those settings. You got to make sure you're identifying bridges, not putting up walls, and whether it's technology, space, the older you get with your students. And then the second one will be station teaching, where you're going to have 3, if not 4 stations with at least 2 adults. In some cases, we put 3 adults in a larger space, like a co-teaching lab. And it's going to be different content broken up. And one of those stations, obviously, is going to be an independent station where the students are working cooperatively with each other or on their own silently with previously known content. But those are the two we endorse. We have found that one teach, one assist does not work, where you have one lead teacher and one person just facilitates the room. We have not seen much gain in that. And
I've seen that often the person just becomes a monitor for behavior, not for content instruction. They're just sort of like, oh, hey, she's teaching right now, or hey, he's trying to pull you in here. Would you get back on task? As opposed to
certified teacher becomes a glorified assistant, and we actually take our classified assistants and we train them how to work on these stations as well.
So my second question is, you talked about culture over process, and I'm curious about how quickly it appears that you and your system embraced this idea that classroom teachers are going to be working together at the hip. That doesn't always happen so quickly. I'm curious about what might have been the approach that you took to get there.
In honesty and saying we're going to build the house, the foundation strong. We're going to have a 10-year journey. And we know that we're building a different student, and that our middle school and our high school students that we're putting into this model in 2015, that they didn't grow up this way. We're going to build a student that productively struggles, because our why is preparing students for quality life, right? And we believe that what's good for special education students is good for regular ed students. So I think we had great two-way communication structures. We supported them, and we led it from the district to our principals. And we didn't have our principals on board initially. We had to get them on board first. We had to rebrand what special education was going to be. Special education historically, because of litigation and compliance, has been about checking boxes, not about people. We want to be about people instead of paper, and understand that negligent practices happen. Let's address negligence. Well, let's unleash and empower our special education teachers to be who God made them to be, which is really what they want to do and intervene with students and do it through people.
In the leadership model I use to advise others, there's a dimension called the leader's learning work. And that's really kind of like the mind of the work of an organization's work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, supporting resilience. Now, you've just used this phrase earlier, and so I want to kind of return to it. As I learned about Close the Gap Kentucky, you referred to this phrase, a productive struggle. And so I see that term as another way of speaking to resilience and deeper learning and deeper leading. And I just wonder if you'd just take a moment and speak to why productive struggle is such an essential part of learning and leading.
Well, what we ask everybody in our district to be accountable to it. That adults have to be willing to productively struggle. We want a district of a growth mindset, starting with me as superintendent, that, we're always growing. And we've got to set that table of, it doesn't matter if you've done 1 year, if you've done 20 years, we can all grow in the name of students. That's really our why. So when we talk about students specifically are going to enter a world with adversity, I think we all would recognize that. We would all prescribe to that thought. And if the first time they struggle and they're thinking, struggle with whatever it may be that's a comprehensive student experience, if the first time that happens is after they leave us. So we want to make sure we're putting students in positions from preschool up to have learning opportunities that are rigorous, to have work that's challenging. And are we going to have a working endurance, a stick-with-itness, I guess you would say, to persevere? So what does that look like? I'll give you an example from when I was a teacher. I use this example a lot in 2014, 15, because I came to my role as a teacher. I didn't have prior principal experience, so I always try to have that teacher hat on. For example, I taught third grade for many years. I was an elementary special education teacher. And we would have what are called cold reads or fresh reads, depending on the series you endorse. And it's where they have a 5-question sheet based off a reading passage. Well, for my third graders, before we would say, oh, here's an easier version. Here's a first grade version, a second grade version. And we always had great communication with parents. We talked about what productive struggle would be and why we needed to do it. And we'd give them on grade level tasks. And once every 5 weeks, we give them a fourth grade cold read and say, what are you going to do with this? Are you going to just shut down and quit? Will you pick your pencil up and write something? And early in the school year, they would always struggle. There would be some tears, and we'd have great communication with parents. But throughout the year, we would see, okay, if we raised the bar for students and we supported them and we coached them through it, not only were we seeing that students were responding, but also that, we were building a student that was persevering. And that's not just a thing for students with disabilities. That's just a thing for all students. But if we're truly preparing them for a quality life, and that's our vision and our mission, we've got to expose them to struggle. That struggle, that's really where the learning is.
Yeah, productive struggle is different than perpetual struggle. Perpetual struggle may destroy the human spirit, but productive struggle, and you've given them all this support and all this planning ahead of time, gives them the ability to really, I guess, persevere and be successful. So that's exciting.
Purpose to it. If there's no purpose and there's no learning to it, then it's not really productive struggle.
Then it's just struggle.
Yeah, that's right.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
That while we have natural leanings and gifts, there are no perfect leaders. That we all have areas of improvement, and that we have to be humble in the gifts we have and the shortcomings we have as well, and also just be persistent in our growth. Because if we're truly about people and we're servants, and that's what we really hope in Meade County Schools that we are, and I hope I'm modeling that as superintendent, is that if our why is about students and we're serving others to serve students, we have to look in the mirror first and say, I'm not perfect. And that my ego, because I think we would all recognize that we have them, I have to check that at the door. That's something we say in our leadership team, because we got to come together, and we're not always going to agree on everything, but can we agree on what's best for students and what we're going to be willing to sacrifice for our team to move forward in the name of students.
And we'll be right back. An Imperfect Leader is brought to you by EdConnective, whose mission is to ensure student success through transformative teacher training. EdConnective helps teachers move from awareness about strategies and frameworks to successful and consistent implementation. Their friendly coaches celebrate classroom success with teachers, and with concrete classroom data, support teachers in their growth, one step at a time. I've been thinking about this a lot. During the pandemic, student teachers didn't get a chance to do their student teaching with children. They just started teaching in classrooms. And they need help. Across the nation, states are adopting higher expectations to make up for learning loss. That's where EdConnective fits in. Their vision is that every student deserves a great teacher, and every teacher deserves a great coach. Find out more by contacting them at edconnective.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. Dr. Mark Martin is my guest, and Mark is the superintendent of Meade County Schools in Meade County, Kentucky. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they had to make, and then we discuss it. So, Mark, what happened?
First year as superintendent was in 2020. Our prior superintendent retired February 28th, 2020. So he had some pretty good timing. He became a superintendent in Florida. So during the search, I was named superintendent that spring, and I think we all know what happened that summer. There were a lot of legitimate worries about could we have in-person school. And I know that each state was different in its approach. But in Kentucky, in the summer of 2020, we had recommendations about how could you go to in-person school. Not executive orders at that point. Those executive orders would come later in 2020 into 2021. But and as a first-year superintendent, you're really trying to always come back to what's best for students. Also, how do you balance that out against your state health department? Your governor is saying, it's not safe to go to school if this is the case for your community. So in Kentucky at that time, we had a metric map. I think other states may have had one as well. And there were people that agreed with the map. There were people that disagreed with the map. I try not to look at that as superintendent. You just always go back to what do I need to do to make sure our students are getting access to, their learning. But I will say the map was not conducive for students going to school. So very briefly, out of 100,000 people, if your community was averaging 25 out of 100,000, you would go to a new color category that would put you in a state where you shouldn't go to school. I'm right on the Indiana-Kentucky line here west of Louisville, Kentucky, a mile and a half in my office from Indiana. In Indiana, it was 200 out of 100,000. So every state had their own threshold. Luckily, we did not have as much COVID in Kentucky in August, September, and October as other counties across state, and we were staying under that threshold. But the governor was asking us to look at it every Thursday and make a decision every Thursday night for the following week. So I want you to think about my community for a moment and my teachers and my students wondering, were we going to have to transition to virtual learning? We started the year in virtual learning, the first 6 to 7 weeks. We transitioned in person, but it was going to be a week-to-week call coming from me as superintendent. And the recommendation was to follow the map. There was a lot of angst in our community. Our teachers didn't know which day they'd be doing what. Our students were having a hard time being settled. We didn't have good learning momentum. So I would say we went 3 to 4 weeks. And then in mid-October of 2020, we were right there on the 25 line. Also, I want you to know that this map was about 7 to 10 days behind on its count of cases because the health departments were overwhelmed when new cases come to them. So we kind of did our own math and realized that the map was not accurate on either side. And sometimes it was favorable to us and sometimes it wasn't, but it was going to come down to a Thursday night call. This one particular evening, we were over 25. And I made the decision as superintendent, we were going to wait till Sunday night. I wanted to look at it one more time because we weren't under an executive order. It was still my decision. And on Sunday night, the way we had the metric by cases, we were under 25, but the metric had us barely over like 25.1 or 25.2. And I made the call to call school off that week for in-person instruction. And we went to virtual instruction just for that week. And I will tell you that that was a mistake on my part. Hindsight's 2020. And I did not do what was best for students. I will tell you that night, I have no shame of telling you this. I cried myself to sleep that night as a leader. I don't do that very often. We've lost a couple of students during my tenure. Had automobile accidents. Obviously, that's the worst case scenario as a leader. But I will tell you after that was a decision that I made where I did not do what was best for students. And I knew in my heart, at least our primary and elementary students should be going to school. We were very aggressive during the pandemic when our governor was recommending 2 days a week hybrid learning. We did that for our middle school, high school, but our elementaries went 5 days a week. So I felt like up to that decision, Peter, that I had made good decisions for students, at least our youngest ones going daily because they needed access to in person. I didn't do it that night. And I think I was given into the noise. And I think sometimes as a leader, that what I've reflected and learned is that we really have to block that noise out, do the best we can with our decisions. No, we can't make everybody happy, but try to do what was best for students. So I went to my board chair shortly thereafter. Luckily, we got back under 25 because there were proponents that liked what we did. We had some teachers that agreed with the decisions, very many that disagreed with it. But I told our board chair, our community is in flux. Every week, the state health department governor is telling us, look at this weekly. We're the practitioners on the ground. I'm seeing what's doing to our community. and it's dividing the community. It's putting the community unrest, and we cannot live and die by a map that is not even accurate, that's 7 to 10 days behind. But I will tell you, we looked at other sources of data. What were we seeing? Did we have enough staff to go to school? And from that point on, we never missed another day of school due to staffing. We never missed another day of school that wasn't executive ordered out. We did have some executive orders that we had to comply with for short stints. But I would say what I learned from that decision is you've got to do what's best for students and trust your gut. The Board of Education, elected officials put you there in that position. And you have to have the professional courage to do what's right by students.
Let's dig into this a little bit. First of all, superintendents across the nation were put into an impossible situation. And I wouldn't just say superintendents, boards of education and superintendents were put into an impossible situation. You were, depending on the state, depending on how the executive branch at that state was directing school districts, some would say you have local control, others would say this is coming from the state. Sometimes it changed and flipped back and forth. We were all put in impossible positions. And to think that, I think many of us went to sleep crying, trying to figure out how can I best keep my community together, united for children, because they were tearing each other apart. And superintendents were at the center of that. I really am grateful for your reflection. One question I always ask in an after action review is, what got overlooked? And it sounds like a part of what got overlooked was the actual story and data within your community as compared to a map that the state was putting out that was delayed 7 to 10 days. Would there be anything else to your thoughts about what got overlooked in this situation?
First, I would agree 100% with what you just said. We were not leaning enough on what our data was telling us on the ground, what we were seeing. Yes to that, 100%. And to our team's credit, we quickly adjusted from there and started using our data as the main data. And we had to defend that a lot. People that disagree with our decisions to go to school many times, but luckily, those families had an option to go virtual learning. I think it really was about me. I think that I was a first few months superintendent, had already from July to October, just really, as everyone across the country was faced with an unprecedented situation there was no playbook for. I remember asking former superintendents that I had lunch with from our community that were in their 90s. There's a gentleman named Mr. Pepper that I have lunch with each month that's 94.
He said, I just missed the 1918 Spanish flu. Sorry, buddy.
That's right. And I said, Mr. Pepper, what would you do about this? He said, there's no playbook for this. It's all guesswork. I think it came down to me as a leader to follow a rule that was not sound mathematically. It was not sound in its medical reasoning, and let the noise influence me too much. And I think it was about me. I think I'm the one that should take the blame for that. And I did. And I think it really just came down to my maturity as a leader. So I guess the way that for anybody that's listening, that's a young principal or a young school counselor, young superintendent, you really have to slow things down, in your mind, be comprehensive in your look at the data, but also, come back to that essential question. Are students safe? Students were safe. All the data was showing us that. Our employees were safe. We had measures put in place, and I didn't have professional courage to do what was right by students. And that was the last time I made a decision like that in the pandemic. And I am proud of that.
What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Trust between my board and I. So I'm a first-year superintendent with 5, new board members to me that this is unprecedented for them as well. And I think a trust of we understand where you made the decision from. We're also glad you reflected on it. And now we're going to work together to really do what's best for Meade County. There are 120 counties in Kentucky. Our situation is going to be different than the other 119. Let's do what's best for our county based off our data.
I believe you're right. When you think about the relationship a new superintendent has with their board of education, there are moments that define that partnership. And it's true, you also, because of elections, you have new board members coming on all the time. So you're trying to maintain this cultural field that exists between the superintendent, who's responsible for the school district, and the Board of Education, who's responsible for the community's schools. And so it's a sometimes tenuous relationship. And here you were serving as a lead learner, and I'm sure that had to have built such deep respect on both sides for you and them, right? To have a sense of loyalty to them, and them to have a deep loyalty towards you and the decision-making process that you use. What frustrated you?
The way that leaders were pitted against other leaders a little bit, unintentionally maybe. For example, we were recommended to start out virtually, but it was almost communicated to superintendents as it was you better do this or else. And when you take a more experienced superintendent, like Mr. Rob Clayton in Warren County Schools, Kentucky Superintendent of the Year in Kentucky this year, he gets with his board much earlier in August and says, I think we can go. We're just going to go. Even if they just went 2 days a week. But they started, mid-August, late August. We waited till late September when the governor asked us to. That was really tough for me as a first-year superintendent to see that, and probably influenced why I didn't pull the trigger quicker on some things and continue to follow the rules. Because what if I don't, follow the rules, and so I think strength in numbers.
The eye of Sauron being, sort of cast on your district. You'd rather not be spotlit. And I can tell you, having been a district that was spotlighted, because I was in a university town, I had virologists and infectious disease experts and health department directors and everyone saying, it is not yet time for us to be fully back in. And so as we were making decisions not to be back in, we were then drawing the ire of those at the state capitol to the point where they held a joint hearing in our community and offering families vouchers as a way to sort of say, well, listen, your public education system has betrayed you, so would you accept a voucher? So it had nothing to do with the pandemic anymore. It was about pushing other political agendas. And so, you're speaking to the truth of districts looking at each other and not being as unified as you might have hoped. So that sounds like, in the end, what was good that came out of this experience in terms of how you've grown as a leader, how you can be that support for any new person coming in. Would you describe any other positives that came out of this experience?
So many silver linings of the pandemic. We decided to hold on to the rope together. And when it got hard to hold on to it, we tied a rope, knot in that rope, and we held on tighter. And we really leaned on each other. And anytime I was down, I think we would all admit during the pandemic, we had our moments of breaking points of, is this going to be better? And we always had teammates here in my school district at all levels that would pick you up and say, hey, we'll hold back on with you. And we came out of this stronger, unified. I would say culturally, I'm very confident we are stronger today than we were in 2019.
Again, today was Dr. Mark Martin. And Mark, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. In a recent conversation I had with a superintendent trying to make sense of their data, they paused and they said, I sure wish I had more opportunities to learn alongside other leaders. And that's exactly what you're doing every single day in your descriptions of the work that you did throughout the pandemic. But certainly, as you've come out and now are really leading with Closing the Gap Kentucky, you're bringing educators together. They're together to learn, to lead together. You're closing that isolation gap for leaders and their teams. And so I say, well done. Where's a good place for listeners to find you if they have questions about Close the Gap Kentucky?
Yeah, you can go to closethegapkentucky.com.
So much again for being my guest.
Thank you for the opportunity, Peter. It's always a pleasure to talk about Meade County Schools. We have an outstanding team here, and I am blessed to work at Meade County Schools as superintendent.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.